Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first York County Civil War Roundtable of 2022, believe it or not. Here we are on January 19th. It's hard to believe. The time is passing so quickly, and we're in a new year. Um, Please bear with me if I sound a little groggy or congested because I've had one of those wonderful head colds that we all get this time of year. So far, it doesn't seem like it's anything worse. But anyway, uh, I'm happy to be hosting for the History Center tonight as we welcome the Civil War Roundtable. Obviously, we always thank Kathy Friel, Program Director, and Scott Mingus and Scott Rosenau, the Assistant Program Directors, for working with us and bringing this great programming to us every month. And tonight, well, I will be introducing our speaker in a few minutes. But as always, I like to start by talking about some upcoming events. So a week from tonight, as you are all aware, we usually host the All Vets organization as one of our other library partner programs. And All Vets will be welcoming Vietnam veteran Ken Baer, who was a tanker in the Vietnam conflict, and he'll be discussing his experience at 7 p.m. That's a week from tonight. And that is an in-person event, but we also live stream it on Zoom. On February 1st and February 15th, we will be having the second and third of a series of programs for homeschool students, which we're calling Homeschool Days, at the Agricultural and Industrial Museum on Princess Street in York. The first presentation, I should say both of these are scheduled for 11 to 12 p.m. on the 1st and 15th. The first program on the 1st, the program is called What's the Code? So we'll be discussing coding, basic coding, and how those sorts of things are developed. The second program is called Gear Up, and that will be more focused upon some artifacts from the Industrial Museum and some of the gears that we have in various machinery. Students will also be able to experiment with gears and learn how they work. So if you have any students or know of any students who might be interested in those programs, please check out our website and get in touch with us. On February 6th, that is Sunday, February 6th, from 2:30 until 4:30. Actually, it should be 4 p.m., but I think they usually run over a little bit. We will be hosting the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society, and their program that afternoon will be presented by Charles Kaufman and is entitled Pennsylvania's Celtic Language Heritage. So a little bit early for St. Patrick's Day, although we should admit the Celtic language includes Irish as well as Scottish influences. And for any students of Pennsylvania history or genealogy, we know very well the Scots-Irish influence in our area of Pennsylvania was very strong. So Mr. Kaufman will be visiting the Genealogical Society on the afternoon of February 6th. So please feel free to attend. Again, that's an in-person event, and it will also be live streamed on Zoom. On February 12th, that's Saturday, February 12th at 10:30 in the morning, we will be having our second Saturday lecture called Brewing in York. And this will be presented by Rich Wagner, Pennsylvania brewery historian, who I personally have known for many years, from way back when I was doing some research in grad school on the Prohibition era. Mr. Wagner hails from the Philadelphia region, and he has written a number of books and a number of articles for, I think, at least 30 years. He's been researching Pennsylvania brewery history, and he's worked in a lot of different towns in eastern Pennsylvania, and just recently, within the last 6 or 8 months, has been doing research in York and has visited the History Center multiple times to kind of draw out this hidden history that we have. And it's unfortunate that we don't actually have a lot in the library and archives on brewing, because there were a number of legitimate and serious breweries that operated for many years in the city of York, and some that operated elsewhere in the county as well. So Mr. Wagner will be coming for our second Saturday lecture on February 12th. Please join us for that. So probably many of you are thinking, we're here tonight, but just a month from now, we'll have another one of these roundtables. So what do you have for us? Well, we are very happy to be welcoming back Scott Mingus and Jim McClure, who will be presenting Rediscovering York County's Lost Underground Railroad and Civil War Sites. If you don't know the names of Scott Mingus and Jim McClure, you're probably not from York County, or this is your first time attending one of our roundtables. Scott and Jim have presented at many roundtable discussions over the years, and obviously are both prolific authors, not on Civil War topics as well as York County topics. So their presentation will discuss, when it comes to understanding the Civil War or any history, there's nothing like tramping around York County's 900 plus square miles to find sites with meaning. And two veteran trampers, Scott and Jim, have chosen a score of places among many that have significance to our often overlooked and astounding Civil War history. Where exactly did Freedman Samuel Smith operate his family's underground railroad station near Shrewsbury? Where is Horse Thief Lane, and why is it so named? Please join Scott and Jim at next month's YCWRT meeting to find out. So that will take place on the third Wednesday of February at 7 p.m. and it will be on Zoom. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Bradley M. Gottfried, and he will be presenting Hell Comes to Southern Maryland, the story of the Point Lookout Civil War prisoner of war camp. Dr. Gottfried earned his PhD in zoology from Miami University in 1976 and served as college educator for over 40 years, rising to the presidency of 2 colleges before he retired in 2017. He has written 16 books on the Civil War. His major interest is in mapping the campaigns of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. When not writing, he is a Gettysburg licensed town guide and an Antietam licensed battlefield guide. He also teaches an online environmental biology class every semester from Montgomery County Community College. I just think it's fascinating that we're able to get speakers who have such diverse interests. You know, people like me, I generally look at history stuff, but we're very, very happy to have, and maybe you can draw on some of this. I'm sure you do draw on some of this in what you've been able to find about the Civil War. Dr. Gottfried lives in Fayetteville, Pennsylvania with his wife, Linda, and they have 4 children and 5 grandchildren between them. So, and one thing I'd like to recommend to everybody, in talking with Dr. Gottfried before we went live this evening, he has a number of books that are available for purchase, and there's a lot of information about the research that he has conducted over the years on his website, which I have the web address right there, www.bradleygottfried.com. So please check that out. And one final thing, as you all know from our many Zoom meetings so far over the last year and a half, we'd ask you to save your questions for the end. I will be monitoring the chat feature. If you can put them in there, that would be great. If you prefer to use the Q&A, we can do that too. And if you are watching us tonight on Facebook, I will be looking for comments there. So save your questions for the end, and we will have plenty of time to discuss any questions you might have. So I will stop my share and turn things over to Dr. Gottfried.
Great. Well, thank you, Adam. It's great to be here. I wish I were with everyone in person, but hopefully in the future we'll be past this difficult time. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak on a topic that a lot of people don't really know about. I didn't know much about it. As Adam mentioned, I do a lot of military history. I do a lot of mapping. Many of you may be aware of my Maps of Gettysburg book and Maps of Antietam books, etc. We lived in Southern Maryland for 11 years when I was president of the College of Southern Maryland. And in Southern Maryland, it was the largest prisoner of war camp in the country. And this was for Confederate prisoners. Obviously, there were larger ones in the South, but Point Lookout had over, at any one time, a total of almost 52,000 Confederate soldiers were housed there. And so we became interested in that topic, and my wife and I wrote a book. You can see that. It's not a really thick one. Hell Comes to Southern Maryland. It's the history of this Point Lookout prisoner of war camp. And what I'm going to do is share my screen with you. Let's see, there it is. And we'll go from the beginning. Okay. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, so we'll hopefully have time for questions and answers. This is an artist representation of the southern end of Southern Maryland. And I don't know how many of you have actually been to Southern Maryland, but Southern Maryland is composed of Charles County, Calvert County, St. Mary's County, and some will consider parts of Prince George's County as well. In order to understand why the largest prisoner of war camp was housed in this peninsula or on this peninsula, you need to know about the Hammond General Hospital. I don't have time to really get into detail on it, but this became one of the largest hospitals in the nation, and it is going to be housed. So here is Southern Maryland here, just to get oriented. The Chesapeake Bay, the Potomac River, as you can see, Washington, and way, way down at the very bottom of St. Mary's County, where the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River meet, that is where Point Lookout is located. And you might say, well, why would you put a hospital there? And later on, why would you put a prisoner of war camp? Where will a lot of the fighting be going on? Spotsylvania County, in Stafford County, and some of these other counties. And think about it. You've got wounded men. You simply take them to Potomac River. You put them on steamers down the Potomac River, right to the tip of St. Mary's County. And you can say the same thing about prisoners of war. And what's so fascinating about this hospital is its layout. We don't have hospitals like this today. You can see that there were a radiating spoke arrangement with a central connecting ring, 15 wards that were quite long, as you can notice. And one of them, this one right here, which was for the doctors, where they lived, where their offices were. There were some structures in the middle, etc. And when we think about a hospital today, you know, if you have a 400-bed hospital, that's big. This hospital had over 1,400 beds, so they could accommodate many, many wounded and sick soldiers. Okay, now I'm going to abruptly stop and get into Point Lookout, and you'll understand why in just a few minutes. But I want to give the flavor of Point Lookout, and I rather than keep you in suspense, the reason why they're going to put it in Southern Maryland, this new prisoner of war camp, is because the infrastructure was already there. They had stables, they had warehouses, they had all of these structures associated with the hospital. Why not use them also for the prisoner of war camp? And we'll get more into that, obviously, in the future. Well, what happened to prisoners of war before the Point Lookout came about? Initially, there was a real problem. And the problem was that many of the prisoners who were captured on the battlefield, for instance, were being held in prisoner of war camps in both sides. There was no formal treaty between the North and the South that was governing what do you do with these prisoners of war. And one of the reasons why there was no treaty is when you think about it, the Lincoln and the Lincoln administration did not want to negotiate directly with the South because it would be almost like validating their existence, like they're a sovereign nation. And so we're conducting negotiations with them. But there was such an uproar Imagine if you've got a young son and he's been captured at, let's say, during the Peninsula, or Yorktown, for instance, in 1862, and he's being held in a Southern prisoner of war camp, and you don't know what's going to happen to him. There was so much pressure that the Lincoln administration finally agreed to having a negotiation that led to the Wool Hill Cartel. And this came about, as you can see, on July 22nd, 1862. It was really modeled on the British and American treaty that occurred during the War of 1812. It was a numeric system. So one Confederate private would be exchanged for one Union private. There were a certain number of privates for a sergeant, for instance. But this last bullet, I find to be very interesting. When they negotiated this agreement, they said this was not going to be, nothing is real. This is so important. Nothing is going to cause us to dissolve this agreement. Well, we're going to see that's not the case. So before the cartel, you had a lot of holding centers. And what's fascinating is how the numbers of prisoners of war declined very rapidly after the cartel. Look at Camp Douglas, for instance. It went from 8,000 soldiers or prisoners of war to less than 400. I mean, very, very quickly, because what's happening now is that they're going to be first paroled on the battlefield, and then they're going to be formally exchanged. And after the exchange process, they're supposed to return to their units. Same thing with Fort Delaware. So a dramatic reduction. And so therefore, the North and the South didn't have to worry about prisoners of war because it was just a short matter of time before they would be released to go back to their armies. Well, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton never liked the cartel, didn't believe in it, didn't think that it should have happened. And he finally was able to get rid of the cartel during the, as you can see, June 28th, 1863, through General Orders number 72. Basically what's happening, it's according to him, is that the South was cheating. What's happening is they're capturing all of these Union soldiers and paroling them, but rather than these Union soldiers going back to their home and waiting for them to be exchanged, 1 for 1 or 5 privates for a sergeant, etc., they weren't returning back to the army. And so they were actually deserting. That, and also when you started to, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after you started to have African-American soldiers joining the United States Army, the South did not like this, obviously, and they're looking for ways to try to minimize the impact. And they said arbitrarily, this cartel does not apply to soldiers of color or their white officers. And if we capture any of them, we're not going to abide by the cartel. In fact, we might even kill them. And then you had, and Grant's arithmetic is a little exaggerated. I mean, he could count, obviously. But think about it. Let's say it's Spotsylvania Courthouse, and you capture 6,000, 5,000 Confederates. Do you really want to return them back to Lee's army? Lee is, and all the Confederate armies are bleeding. They're getting smaller and smaller as they're expending their manpower. Do you really want to have this exchange process? Rather hold on to these young men and not allow them to go back into the enemy army. And so as a result of the stalling of the cartel, the prisoner of war camps took on a new role, and that was simply to hold on to their prisoners. There was not going to be any paroles. There was not going to be any exchanges, and they became long-term facilities. And there were actually, most people don't realize this, 37 prisoner of war camps in the North. Some only had a handful of men. Some, like Point Lookout, as we'll see, had over 51,000. Some of these you probably recognize. And here we come to Point Lookout. So I had already mentioned right here is the hospital. And what we're going to see is if you look further north along the peninsula, you're going to see two pens. You're going to see camps. These are where the guards are located. And suddenly you're going to start to see around the time, actually a little bit after Gettysburg, you're going to start to see the formation of this prisoner of war camp, again, because of one, the infrastructure was already there, and two, look, it's surrounded by water on three sides, the Potomac River, the Chesapeake Bay, and the only place where there potentially could be escapes would be to the north. But even there was some water, as you can notice. And so the actual prisoner of war camp at Point Lookout in St. Mary's County was officially created on July 20th. So this is just a few weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. And they designed it for 10,000 prisoners. Two pens. Here's one pen you can see, and here's a smaller pen. And this is where the prisoners are going to be housed. As we're going to see, this is the only prisoner of war camp in the North that did not have wooden barracks. They only had tents. So you had tent cities. We're going to see a number of mess halls right here that are going to feed the men. This is where the tent city is. And right over here in the smaller area would be where these, in some cases, you had 20,000 men in a 20-acre pen. Maybe this is 8 acres, spending most of the day. Our guard camps are going to be to the north here and over here. And the prison hospital was designed to be in between the two camps or the two pens. This pen was to be for the enlisted men, 20 acres. This smaller pen was to be for officers, but eventually there are going to be so many men, enlisted men, that they're going to transfer the officers to other prisoner of war camps and take over this area as a hospital. And smallpox continued to be a major issue. You don't want to have a smallpox hospital anywhere near men. And so that's going to be located as far north as they possibly can put it to avoid as much contagion as they can. This is a color photograph or a color representation of that 20-acre pen. All of these are tents. Again, you can actually see the men milling around the mess halls, the guard tents over to the north. Now, what's interesting is if you start looking at the, do this here, how the numbers of prisoners changed through the war. July 1863, remember, the camp is established the third week of July, and by the end of July, there's only 136 prisoners. But look what happens by October. It gets up to over almost 8,000 prisoners of war, Confederate prisoners, are being housed at Point Lookout. Remember, they designed it for 10,000 men. And as you can imagine, there's going to be all kinds of shortages when you go from fewer than 200 men to almost 8,000. There's going to be all kinds of logistical issues. And this is going to, this slide shows the fluctuations. Before I get into them, look over to the left. What's interesting is this was probably the prisoner of war camp that may have been closest to Washington, and yet, unlike Elmira and Camp Douglas and many of these other northern prisoners of war camps, very, very few photographs. This is one of the few actual photographs. These are officers that are just arriving after being captured at the Battle of Gettysburg. And you can see they look like they're in pretty good shape. You know, you don't see any torn uniforms or they're not tattered in any way. But look to the right. And you can see how the numbers fluctuate. 1864, it goes from almost 9,000 down to 6,000, up to 15,000, down to 13. Some cases, men are dying. In other cases, and in a lot of cases, you were finding that as the camp got larger, they would transfer men out of the camp to other prisoners of war. But look at April 20th, or April of 1865, 20,000 men. And this is what I find amazing. During Lee's retreat, Sailor's Creek and other engagements, you know, hundreds and thousands of Lee's soldiers were being captured. Now, Lee was on the run, and maybe the Union High Command thought that that the war was going to stretch on for months. They didn't know that Lee was about ready to surrender. But rather than just hold on to these prisoners of war, they sent them to Point Lookout. And when the war is over, when the last army is going to surrender at the end of April, you're going to still see these prisoner of war camps operating into May, into June, and these men getting very, very frustrated about their future. So who was incarcerated? Well, this is just a snapshot. Arbitrarily, we took May 20th, 1864, when there were about 11,000 prisoners of war at Point Lookout. Officers, you can see at this point, they were still being housed there, almost 600, 10,000 enlisted men. But what's interesting is the number of civilians. And you could get a free ticket, a one-way ticket to Point Lookout for a variety of reasons. Subversive activity was one, spying, smuggling, all kinds of activities that was counterproductive to the Union cause would send you to Point Lookout. And in some cases, we know, and we talk about it in the book, many of these civilians, well, some civilians, but some soldiers were actually women who were dressed up as men. Okay, Surgeon James Thompson. He's a Union surgeon. He's assigned to Point Lookout. It is his role to try to provide medical assistance to the prisoners of war. And he is going to write to Washington in June of 1864, 12,000 men. Remember, it's created for 10,000. So you already have more men that are supposed to be in this 20-acre pen. And he writes to Washington. He says, I just don't want you to send any more prisoners, because if you do, these extra men are going to lead to an epidemic, and we're going to have a lot of deaths. And what does the Union Authority High Command do? Right after this, they sent an additional 100 men. Now, what they were not, they didn't have anything against James Thompson. It was a matter of expediency. They needed to place these prisoners of war somewhere, and they're going to go to Point Lookout. Now, as I mentioned, there was a constant churn, prisoners of war coming in, prisoners of war dying, or being transferred out. But, you know, Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton, they really didn't want to run a prisoner of war camp or any of these camps. And they looked for ways to reduce the population. And in the very beginning of 1864, Lincoln says, hey, I've been having conversations with Secretary of War Stanton, and we've decided that there's going to be two classes. One, if people or soldiers who will take the oath of allegiance to the Union, and if they enlist in our service, meaning we call them galvanized Yankees, we'll give them a uniform, blue uniform, we'll give them a rifle, we will release them from the camp, and they will serve in the Union Army. Fascinating thing is that, and by the way, about, oh gosh, almost 2,000 prisoners of war are going to accept this invitation. They can leave the camp, they can get better food. But where do they send these men initially? Norfolk, Virginia. So, you know, here they are. Many of them were Virginians. being sent to Virginia. And I think the Union High Command realized that was not such a good idea. And so they're going to send them to the Dakotas, where they're going to be fighting the Sioux Indians. And second, those who take the oath of allegiance and whose homes are behind or within Union lines, will let them go as well. And so thousands of men are going to leave because of those two possibilities. Let's talk about the Guards. Guards are a mixed match. This is simply a compilation of some of the different Guards. If you look at them, the 2nd, the 5th, and 12th New Hampshire, these are veterans. These guys know how to fight. And the 4th Rhode Island as well. This was R&R for these men. They were exhausted from fighting. They needed a break. What are we going to do with them? We'll send them to Point Lookout, where they can guard these prisoners of war. Some of them were African-American troops, colored troops, the 4th and 36th. So there was quite a variety. This illustration to the left, if you can see it, is an actual woodcut of what these, now this is the guard camps, and this is probably the Potomac River right over here. Another snapshot, May 20th, 1864, there were almost 1,700 guards. And if you look at it, you'll see a vast majority are, I mean, there's quite a mix, but the majority of the troops are of colored, US colored troops, although a close second would be the New Hampshire and Rhode Island infantry. The prisoner of war camp, as I mentioned, was composed of 2 pens. In both cases, they are going to be 14 feet. The boards are 14 feet high, but if you look at them and you measure them, they're only 12 feet high because they extend down 2 feet down below the ground. They didn't want people, obviously, soldiers, prisoners of war, burrowing out from under the stockade wall. 2-inch planks. And then you can see it here. There's a walkway on the outside, 3 feet wide. And the guards would then be able to walk along this walkway. And periodically there would be enclosures where they could seek cover if it was too hot or if it was rainy or snowy, and then continue on to walk their beat, so to speak. One of the things that was prevalent, and all the prisoners of war needed to know this, was the deadline. And this is a line right here that stretches about 2 feet before in front of the stockade wall. If you cross that, if you stepped on that line, the guard was supposed to say, warn you that you're about to be shot unless you move back. And in some cases, and this is primarily, and I should mention this, as you can imagine, there was some tension between the African-American guards, many of who had been slaves, and the Southerners. And the African-American soldiers would tell the Southerners, the bottom rail is on the top now, and occasionally would forget to warn a soldier if he crossed the deadline. So in addition to the guards, in addition to the stockade, there was the mighty Potomac flotilla. Actually, it wasn't. You can see they're modified steamboats. This is a side wheeler, and they stuck some cannon on it. And these boats, I guess they're ships, would be patrolling the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River to try to discourage any attempt by the prisoners trying to swim away from the camp, or from others trying to rescue these men. There was and I think many of you know about this, in 1864, when Jubal Early was heading into Maryland and threatening Washington, there was a plan. Bradley Johnson was going to, and Harry Gilmore, a cavalry commander, both Confederates. The plan was for them to take their cavalry command down through southern Maryland, down through St. Mary's County. Boats were supposed to be coming up from across the Potomac River from Virginia carrying arms, and they were going to they're going to overpower the guards. They were going to arm these Confederate prisoners of war. They were going to march up. Imagine 10, 12,000 men marching up toward Washington while Jubal Early, with an equal number, is threatening from the east. This was probably the worst kept secret in the North. Everybody knew about it, and Jefferson Davis killed the plan. But as a result, the Union High Command really looked more closely at the protection of this camp, and they decided to build a line of forts at the northern end, or redoubts. And for those of you who are interested, I strongly recommend that you take a trip down to St. Mary's County. It's very scenic. It feels like the end of the world, but they have recreated Fort Lincoln down there. You can see the stockade wall. They have a very nice museum. It's a very nice excursion. I don't know if you want to do it all in one day, but lots of things to do in Southern Maryland. Okay, the U.S. Sanitary Commission is going to get involved with the Point Lookout prisoner of war camp. We know that it is a private relief agency, it's really just a precursor to the American Red Cross. What it's supposed to do is help Union soldiers, whether they're sick and wounded, provide aid to them. But the Sanitary Commission was hearing reports of Confederate prisoners being mistreated at this newly formed Point Lookout prisoner of war camp. And they asked the Lincoln administration, can we send an inspector down to Point Lookout to see what the conditions are like? And surprisingly, they said, sure, you can do that. And they sent this surgeon, Dr. William Swarm. He's going to file his report November 13th, 1863. So I'm going to talk about what was it like to be a prisoner of war at Point Lookout. And we're going to oftentimes point back to this, the outcome of this report. So think about it. Here it is, January, okay? The Point Lookout prisoner of war camp started in 1863 during the summer. So you've got this winter of 1863-64 and 1864-1865. So you had two brutal winters. And we are a little spoiled. You know, we hop in our cars, we put on the heaters, we put on our thick coats, et cetera, when we go out. But what are some of the variables that are going to be involved in keeping a person warm? Obviously, adequate shelter, good blankets, amount of heat should be present, and adequate clothing. Let's talk about each and every one of these, if we could. First is shelter. As I mentioned, this was the only prisoner of war camp that did not have wooden barracks. These photographs, this one here to the left is actually Elmira, and all of them are consistent in structure. They all look about the same. Eventually, they're all going to be replaced by wooden barracks. They didn't have that. Whatever kind of tent that was available is going to be sent to Point Lookout. And so you're going to have a mishmash of shelter tents, of Sibley tents, such as over here on the right, of hospital tents, et cetera. Anything and everything that can house these men. So I mentioned it was the only one without barracks, wooden barracks. And one of the things I do want to point out is it wasn't that that these prisoners of war were being intentionally mistreated. All you have to do is look at the guards. Did the guards have nice, warm barracks? No, they also had tents. And so it's conceivable that people in Washington thought, okay, Southern Maryland, kind of balmy. We don't need to have these wooden barracks. We'll just send them tents. But some of the problems that we're going to see are exaggerated by the rhetoric of the Union authorities. You know, send anything you can. And they don't have to be anything special, just send them, even if they're defective. In October 1864, so the camp's been in operation for over a year, fully a third of the tents are unfit for use. Yeah, they sent them there, but oftentimes they might have had holes in them. They may have been threadbare, etc. A big issue was flooding. The peninsula periodically would flood, and in the summer, not so bad. But imagine you're lying in your tents, you're freezing cold, and all of a sudden you're soaking wet as the peninsula is flooded. And so what these men will start to do is pay a few cents. They buy empty hardtack boxes or crates, and they create walls and floors to try to keep the moisture out. And what I find interesting is some of the more affluent prisoners of war actually bought enough of these boxes to create entire houses for themselves. And you can see how much it cost, not a whole lot, to build the comfort of a house. Okay, so tents were a problem. Oftentimes deficient, inferior, but nevertheless, they were sent and the Union authorities did try to shelter them in. What about blankets? I apologize, there's too much writing here, but this is from Dr. Swarm's report from the Sanitary Commission. And you can see crowded around a few coals. Some have good blankets, others pieces of carpet. Generally, they have one blanket to 3 men, but a great many are entirely without. Now, again, we're talking November 1863. After this report came out, as we'll see, the Lincoln administration said, we can't do this anymore. We can't have this bad publicity. And they made sure that every prisoner of war had his own blanket. Colonel Alfred Hoffman was, he oversaw all of the Union prisoner of war camps. And some of his directives were pretty damning. There's a large quantity of inferior blankets on hand. We can't send them to our soldiers, but we could send them to the prisoners of war. So we're not going to buy any. This is one of the prisoners of war, is a Virginian, Peyton, who says many of them had holes in them, were damaged by seawater, etc. So blankets are an issue. How about clothing? Well, again, here is Colonel Hoffman saying there will be no clothing of any kind issued. Now, again, this is early on during the stay of these prisoners of war. As long as they have clothing on him, no matter how torn, you must issue nothing. And here's the kicker. If they have a family who wants to send clothing, a care package, if you will, nope, we won't allow that either. Now, I think there's a reason for that. Think about it. If you have someone who comes from an affluent family and this person keeps getting all kinds of boxes of goodies and clothing, et cetera, and here you have other prisoners who don't have anything, there's probably going to be some discord and maybe some fighting going on. Upon arriving at camp, what would happen would be they would line up all of these men. If you had 2 blankets, one of them was gone. If you had an overcoat, good chance it was going to be taken as well. And they're going to redistribute these items to other prisoners. Most of the men are dirty, ragged. Some may be fortunate to have an overcoat, but it hides the rags beneath. They're in a pitiable condition, destitute of nearly everything, filthy, without shirts, etc. They were in pretty bad shape early on now, and I want to emphasize early on. So this report was pretty damning about how poorly these prisoners of war were being treated. Colonel Hoffman sends to the district commander of St. Mary's County, it appears that you need all kinds of clothing. We don't want to provide much to them, but we don't want them to be destitute, as this report represents. We've got a abundance of inferior clothing on hand, so we'll just send them. Better, I love this one, better to distribute this inadequate clothing than to risk the wrath of subsequent reports. But what's going to start happening, as we're going to see, is more and more frequent inspections. They started allowing families to send care packages to their loved ones. And here's just some of the things that are happening. This is the commander of the post, just before the winter of 1864, 1865, so the last winter. Many of the men are barefoot because their shoes are given out. He's looking for all of this. And pants will arrive, but they're blue in color. And the Union of camp authorities could not accept them, obviously worried that if they escape, they might look like Union soldiers. But if one of the prisoners was a very talented artist. He was a watercolorist, and he created hundreds of illustrations depicting life within Point Lookout. And if you look at the illustrations, yeah, you see some bare feet, you see some tattered clothing, maybe some mending going on, but you don't see anybody, who is totally deficient in clothing. And this is January 21st, 1864, went out and drew clothing, flannel shirts, drawers, shoes. We had inspection to see if we needed pants in the following week. Our division received pants. By the way, division is 1,000 men. They gave barefoot men pairs of shoes. So later on, the logistical supply chain is going to be better, and they're going to do a better job of providing to the needs of the men. I'm just going to skip over this one here. Okay, so we see initially tents are defective, and that's going to continue to be a problem all through the war. Blankets are a problem. There's not enough of them. They will solve this problem. Every prisoner will be given his own blanket. Many of them may be inferior, but at least they're going to be given something. The Union authorities will begin to give them clothing where needed. Let's talk about what else is happening now. Wind goes right through us. One of the nice things about Point Lookout is that they had clay, and clay could be made into bricks, and every tent is going to have a fireplace. But here's the problem. Firewood is going to be distributed only between mid-November through February. Does it get cold in March? Sure it does. Does it ever get cold in beginning of November? Yes. But they have no heat during that time. And when it is distributed during that period, it's 1 cord of wood per division or 1,000 men. What does that come out to be? That comes out to be, think about this, 1 stick of wood or 1 piece of wood per man every other day. So it would mean if you have 14 men in a Sibley tent, each man gets the equivalent of a piece of wood every other day. You have 7 pieces of wood to get through 24 hours, to keep that fire going. And some said that they never felt warm during their entire stay there. Okay, so what do you do if you don't have adequate clothing, adequate heat, etc.? Well, think about it. You share blankets. And so, you get 2 guys, you put them together, you got 2 blankets. 3 guys scrunching together, you got 3 of them. And sometimes they would spoon. So think about it. One is laying next to another and really trying to garner body heat from other individuals. Now, I like spooning with my wife. I don't think I'd want to spoon with some filthy prisoner of war that's on either side of me. But if I'm really cold and I really need more blankets, I really need that body heat, maybe I'm going to do that. But what that's going to lead to are fights. It's going to lead to the spread of diseases, which is a problem. All right, and so this is simply some quotes. 2 men froze to death on the night of December 12th. 5 men froze to death. So you're going to see men not only becoming very ill, but also becoming dying of the intense cold. Food, 6 mess halls. Each of them is giant, about 150, 160 feet long, 25 feet wide, etc. And if you go into each of these, you would not find any chairs. There's going to be long, long tables, several of them. And what's going to happen is you walk in, if you're a prisoner of war, with a whole line of others behind you, and periodically along that table, there's a plate, there might be a cup, there's food on that plate. You'll walk in, you will grab whatever's on that plate. There's no time for you to sit there and eat. You're simply going to grab the food, you're going to walk out, and as you walk out, you're going to be eating the food. Now, I got to show you this because this is pretty neat. At the very beginning of the war, we're talking November of, not the war, but the formation of the prisoner of war camp, November of 1863. Holy cow. What they tried to do was mirror as much as they could what soldiers in the field would receive. Not bad. I wouldn't mind that. But then they started to cut rations, at least twice in 1864. Now, why did they cut the rations? It wasn't that they didn't have funds to provide for the prisoners of war. I want you to imagine you're Secretary of War Stanton, and you are in Annapolis, Maryland, and you're on the docks there, and some men are coming off who had been prisoners of war at Andersonville in Georgia, and they're literally human skeletons. And he was so upset and so furious, he says, okay, we need a way to force the South to take better care of our men. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to cut the rations of their prisoners of war, their men. And so, and what they didn't want it to look like was that we're saving money by cutting rations. Each camp had a prison fund, and this was a fund that they could use to buy blankets. They could use it to buy firewood, all kinds of things that would benefit the prisoners of war. And that's, so they didn't want this to build up, but look what happens. It's fairly small an amount in November of 1863. If you were to take that, that's millions and millions, probably what, maybe 50 million today. So they were actually not using that money to go back and help the prisoners of war. Okay, and you can see that. No complaint has been heard. Okay, so this is what they're going to be, when they cut it initially, early in 1864, breakfast, bread, crackers, and coffee. Loved their coffee. In the dinner, they're going to have vegetable soup. Why vegetable soup? Why was that a staple? Because of scurvy. They did not want scurvy to break out. Pickled pork, fresh beef, 3 to 4 ounces a day. No supper. Okay, fine. But then after June 1st, breakfast would be a piece of bread and a cracker or two, a little bit of milk, of meat, and dinner would be soup. Supper would be none. It would be almost the equivalent of giving one of us 1 McDonald's hamburger a day. with a bowl of watery vegetable soup. And you can imagine these men started to lose weight. The incidence of disease and illness really began to increase. Water was a problem. I don't have time to go into it in any detail, but the water was filled with this iron sulfate that was very sweet. And if you got it on your clothing, if you got it on your chin, it would turn it yellow. And many men wouldn't drink. Finally, they would fill up casks from the upper Potomac River and deliver the water to Point Lookout. But that's going to take a while. Look at this, July of 1860. It's not really going to start getting moving until well after a year after the prisoner of war camp starts. If you were at Point Lookout, anywhere near Point Lookout, the first thing you would know would be the stench. It stunk. They had drainage ditches around each of the tents and sinks. So if you had to relieve yourself, you would, during the day, you would go to this, you'd walk over a plank over the Potomac River, you'd sit down or urinate, and you'd look down and you would see the waters of the Potomac River. What's going to happen is they close up those sinks during the night, and they put tubs all around the camp, and that's where you're going to relieve yourself in the middle of the night. Here's the problem. Many of these men had dysentery, and they're not going to make it to those tubs. And so there's going to be fecal material everywhere. And it's I mean, if you are a prisoner of war, you have it everywhere. It's in your hair, it's on your clothing, it's on your body. It's just hard to imagine how horrible that must have been, and the stench. The daily routine, they had roll call every morning. They'd have a meal at 8, and again, they'd have their dinner between 2 and 3. And the rest of the time, until taps, nothing. And the worst thing, obviously, for men or women or anyone, any human being, is to have nothing to do for long periods of time. So they're going to spend cleaning up and looking for things to do. So here you can see they're looking at an information billboard, etc. They're cleaning up the camp a little bit. But one of the nicest things that you didn't have at Elmira and most of these other prisoner of war camps was the beach. They would open up the stockade to the Chesapeake Bay during the nicer, warmer months, and men could spend the day sunbathing, swimming, catching crabs, doing whatever they wanted. So that was a real plus. And many men became very proficient in the trades. So you could buy jewelry. If you had a toothache, you would have someone who could pull your tooth. Repairs of garments and shoes, etc. At one time, they opened a school, they being the prisoners. 1,200 men were learning how to read and write. Religious services, glee clubs, whatever it took to pass the time, they're going to do it. But you can imagine that you have so many thousands of men in such a small area. There's going to be all kinds of problems in terms of fights, in terms of theft, in terms of gambling was a major issue because they didn't really have money, excuse me. What they had was bartering system. And what did they oftentimes barter? Food. They were given so much to begin with that, but if you had a gambling addiction, good chance you might starve yourself to death. Discipline was an issue. You can see on the left, walking around with a barrel or riding a rail. On the right, being hung up by your thumbs was supposed to be outlawed, and it really did not happen very much, if any. Excuse me. But the worst punishment was not by the guards. It was what was happening when the prisoners would mete out their own discipline. If you were found stealing things from a fellow prisoner, they would take you by your ankles in the night, and they would dip you down headfirst into that tub filled with urine and defecation. You're never going to steal again after that. Shootings, there's several accounts of men, prisoners of war, who were shot, in some cases for good reason, for other cases without provocation. And what really upset the men was when some of these things occurred without recourse, where their the guards were simply allowed to continue, even though they had killed one of the prisoners. Sickness was a problem, and let me just go through that quickly. From a low of 1.3%, or 11, that's not very many, to a high, as you can see, August 1864, over 1,000 men were sick, or almost 10,000 of the men. Can you imagine 10,000 of, of a city, whether it's York or whatever, are all ill at the same time? Deaths also variable. As many as you can see, almost 230 in a month. That's February of 1865, or about 2% of the prisoners died in that 1 month. Causes of death, the great unknown. Probably many of these were diarrhea and pneumonia, but diarrhea, pneumonia, dysentery, those are the big three that cause most of the problems. How many died at Point Lookout? Well, as I mentioned, there were over 52,000 men incarcerated at Point Lookout at one point or another. If you look at the Union official records, they will say almost 3,000, or 5.6% of those who were incarcerated died at Point Lookout. If you go to Point Lookout, and there is a Confederate cemetery there, and some monuments, etc., the monument will list almost 3,400 who died there. One of the authors, Richard Tribby, who had a book a few years ago on Point Lookout, thought that the number was probably closer to 3,700. And there's a descendant group who says, 14,000, that's a little bit high. It probably is somewhere around the mid threes, 3,500, I would suspect. Well, what's happening? In January of 1865, there are so many sick Confederate prisoners that Lincoln, that Stanton, that Grant finally said, we've got to do something. We can't continue to hold these men. Their blood's on our hands. And so what Grant wanted to see was 3,000 men are exchanged every week. Let's start getting them out of here. And it's going to be the sickest that they can find. The healthy ones are going to be exchanged last. As you can see, it's not going to come soon enough. 30,000 Union soldiers, prisoners of war in Southern prisoner of war camps, will perish, 25,000 Confederates. So freedom, we know the last major army surrenders, the end of April. But you can imagine, here you are in April, in May, beginning of June, and you're still being held at all of these prisoner of war camps. And then finally, in mid-June, they are going to be released. And as you can see, they are excited about this opportunity to finally leave this hellhole. So the question becomes, this is Hoffman, by the way, right here, Colonel Hoffman, here's Stanton. Were the prisoners of war intentionally mistreated? Well, there's no question about it. They were. In one component, I would say they were, because it was retaliation. It was the only way that Secretary of War Stanton thought that he could leverage better treatment of Union prisoners of war from who were housed in Southern prisoner of war camps. But a lot of it was incidental. It was not intentional. Poor leadership. What they would do would be to bring someone in, like for instance, General Marston, who was a battlefield commander, totally worn out. They say, okay, we're going to take you out. We're putting you in here, prisoner of war camp, R&R. And as he becomes proficient, as these other soldiers become proficient in running a prisoner of war camp, they're transferred back to the front, and a new person comes in who has to learn the ropes. There are major supply logistical issues. Think about it. I mean, we've got supply issues right now, but you've got a camp with 50,000, I'm going to turn that around, 20,000 prisoners of war on a peninsula far from civilization. It's going to be hard to get enough food. It's going to be hard enough to get them tents and clothes, etc. And finally, the insensitivity. These were unwelcome guests, and they became pawns on either side. Neither Lincoln administration, Jefferson Davis administration, none of them wanted them. They were sort of stuck with them, and they're going to do as little as they can to keep them alive until they can actually exchange them. So that is an overview of the Point Lookout prisoner of war camp. If anyone is interested, a plug, if I were here with you, I'd hold up a book and I'd say, hey, if you're interested in the book, we have it for sale. I can't remember, let me see now, it's $13, including shipping. It's interesting. We're not experts on this material, but it's an interesting read, and I would encourage all of you, if you don't have it, maybe your library has it, but it's something you might want to consider. So with that, Adam, thank you. If anyone has any questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Gottfried. I know I learned a lot. There are a lot of little things, little details that you discussed that I've never heard before. So I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way. Looks like we do have a question. This is from Scott Rosenau. He asks, when there were separate camps, was there a difference in the treatment of officers and enlisted men?
Good question. Thank you, Scott. Definitely were. In the book, I didn't have time to talk about it tonight. The amount of food, the quality of the food, the quality of the materials, the blankets, etc. It was all much superior to what was given to the officers compared to the enlisted men, without question.
All right. This question is from Bill. He asks, could you explain the concept of what parole was for prisoners? Yes.
So a good case in point, and this will help, and I appreciate the question, Bill, because I can get into what happened and some of the evolution of this. What was supposed to happen is on the battlefield, you are captured. So you are with, let's say, well, let me do a Pennsylvania, the 50th Pennsylvania. And you've been captured at, let's say, I don't know, Second Bull Run. And so you will get a piece of paper that says you are paroled and you are in limbo until you are physically exchanged, and then you will get a communication. Most of these men are going to go home and they're going to wait. But what happens as it evolves is that Stanton says many of these men, even after they're exchanged, they're not coming back to their units. And so he is going to create 3 parole camps. And if you ever go to Annapolis, there's a community, an outskirts, a suburb called Parole, Maryland. And this is where, so if you got paroled, you didn't go home, you immediately went to one of these camps. There was another one in Illinois, et cetera, and you would wait there. They had barracks, and you would wait until you were physically exchanged, and then you would go back to your unit. rather than this lax, well, you're paroled, you can go home, and then when you're exchanged, you'll come back again. That wasn't happening. And so that's why they formed these parole camps, to make sure that they were holding on to these guys so they could get back to their units, rather than, because they were considered to be deserters when they weren't coming back after they were exchanged.
There's a similar question on from Richard, and I think you may have just answered this, but when the prisoners were released, how and where how were they sent back to their home states? But I think you kind of just addressed that.
Yeah, and the parole camps, they were not around for very long, but they were very effective in making sure that the Union high command had control over these men, and when they were, as soon as they were exchanged, right back to their units.
If I could insert a question, we do have one other question from Ethan out there, but if I could just insert a quick question from my own perspective here. Have you ever seen any evidence that the Confederacy responded to the kind of corresponding mistreatment on the Union part?
Great question. Thank you, Adam. The treatment of Union prisoners was horrendous. Obviously, we know that Andersonville and Salisbury in North Carolina and other prisoners of war camp were absolutely horrendous compared to Point Lookout and the Union prisoner of war camps. There have been several books that really looked at the South and to determine what was going on. And I think intuitively people will say, well, Anderson occurred and that they mistreated or they did not feed the Union prisoners at Andersonville because they didn't have food, they didn't have resources. Well, the reality is they did. When you think about, remember, Andersonville is where? In Georgia. And when Sherman marched through Georgia, guess what? Did he have wagons full of supplies? No, he lived off the land. And there are stories that some historians have dug up in some instances. For instance, now Florida is not far from Georgia, from Andersonville. There apparently in Florida was a railroad depot that had all kinds of wood that was earmarked for Andersonville to help build shelters. And this historian had shown that the problem was logistical. It wasn't that the South didn't have the wood, it didn't have the food. It was a problem of how do we get the food, the materials to these camps more than anything else. Did it make a difference? No. Even though Stanton tried to encourage, if I can use that word, the South to treat their prisoners of war better, in many cases, I don't want to say they were inept, but I would say in many cases, the Southerners were simply inept and really not able to provide what they should have. I think, if they had someone like a Henry Hampt or others, Meigs, they didn't have anybody like that, and Northrop, who was their commissary officer, when you think about Lee, who's actually begging, if you read his official reports during the winter of 1864, 1865, he's begging Northrop to send food to his army. Yeah, the Confederates were starving. The Confederate Army was starving. And they're actually out there picking edible weeds. And again, a lot of it was there was food in the South, but they weren't able to transport it to the North effectively, to northern parts of the South.
Thank you for that. That's kind of what I was expecting. But the logistical, I think we tend to overlook the logistical problems of the South, even though there's lots that has been written about that from the military side.
Right.
But it's just, well, obviously so unfortunate that those
But, you know,
camps.
Adam, it's an interesting point because, you know, and it's interesting and it's unfortunate because before this pandemic, you know, we never worried about logistics. We never worried about supply chain. And now you go into a giant or any supermarket or a store and you see empty shelves and you start to say, wow, the logistical challenges of stocking those supermarkets is amazing. And I think now we're really starting to understand some of the challenges, some of the issues that we wouldn't have known before.
Right. All right. Well, we do have a question here from Ethan.
Okay.
Did any prisoners at Point Lookout escape?
Yeah, there were several instances where men, especially early on, I think it took some time for, again, the officers, the commanders, the guards to become more proficient. But there were some examples. For instance, there are examples of men who actually were able to swim away. Now, you had to be a very strong swimmer to be able to do that. There were instances where men actually were buried by their buddies in the sand, and after nightfall, they close the gates, all the guards are gone, they unbury themselves and they head on north. So there were, we're talking about under 50, not a lot, but this is primarily 1863, maybe early 1864, but after that, very, very few.
Right. Well, thank you very much for all those answers. If there are any other questions, please feel free to share them either in the chat or in the Q&A. And so far, I haven't seen any questions on Facebook, but I am monitoring that.
Okay, great.
I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the images that you shared, especially, the hand-drawn images. They just brought so much life to the story. I was really fascinated by those.
It was a German immigrant, and I should spend time trying to pronounce his name. It is very long and very German. I have a German name, but mine's much shorter. I mean, we're talking about, it's a very long German name. Very talented. He was a professional artist. And there have been books that have been, if anybody's interested, I can get you the name of the artist. And you can find them online. The University of Maryland has a large collection of these drawings. And you're right, Adam. It is a wonderful repository of, I mean, I just showed a few of them, but there were literally hundreds of them in every facet of a prisoner of war's life. And you can really feel it. You could see it. You can see how they spent the day. You can see how they were clothed. You can see how they interacted with the guards, etc. So it was very fascinating in that regard.
All right. There is a question here from Nola, and she asks, why do you think there was never a permanent commander at the camp?
That's a wonderful question. I think, and again, this is just speculative, they looked at the camp as a transitory posting. That it was, we're going to send commanders there who are burned out. What are we going to do with these guys? You know, Marston, there are others. And you know, these were very effective battlefield commanders who are no longer effective. So do we send them home, or maybe we can make some use of them? But it's one of the mysteries. I totally agree with the question, because it's a question in my own mind. Those camps would have been much more effective if Marston, for instance, was there from the very beginning, as he was all the way to the end of the war. But maybe the Union High Command said, "Hey, we need this guy back." And in fact, if you study the Battle of Cold Harbor, one of the brigade commanders was General Marston. You know, they sent him back to the front. they sent many of these troops back to the front. And so I guess they looked at it as more of an R&R kind of experience. And maybe they didn't realize the learning curve that was required. Maybe they just assumed that they would get to the camp, they would become effective. And if another person came in, another officer in 6 months, then they would become immediately effective as well. But I've never really seen any really rationale as to why they had this rotation. But no commander was there for longer than 6 to 8 months.
All right. Well, there's a very interesting question here from Rob, and he asks, or he says, my great grandfather was allowed to leave Point Lookout in August 1865. Instead of returning to Sandy Hill, North Carolina, he went to New York City. Do you have any idea why that might be the case?
Yeah, I think I might be able to. Initially, what they didn't want to do is open the gates and say, see you later, guys. They felt, at least initially, a obligation to try to get these men home. And so they would group them. They would say, okay, there's a ship going to be leaving for Alabama. So we're going to take all the Alabama soldiers we can fit in this ship, and we're going to send them to Mobile or wherever. Same thing with Georgia. But after a while, they realized this is a very slow process. And they allowed people, they basically said, if you want to leave, that's fine. You can just leave on your own, because the process of transporting these prisoners back to their homes was becoming onerous. And I think that in many cases, people may have, Confederates. I don't know much about the family history of Rob's family history, but might have just said, I have no family in the South. I think I'm just going to strike my fortune in New York City. But when you open the gates, you just never know where anybody's going to be going.
Right. I do not see any questions on Facebook.
Okay.
And we are caught up with questions on Zoom. So,
well, if anyone has any questions after, again, I guess it's still up. You can see my email address. Feel free to contact me. I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. I don't know too much about specific soldiers, John Payton from a Virginia unit. But if there are other questions, I certainly will do my best to answer them.
all right. Outstanding. Thank you very much for your presentation. And the PowerPoint was beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, the images, the maps, everything just really brought it to life. And I tend to be very visual, when I'm looking at military history. But something like this, it just made it so much more easy to visualize.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that.
Right. And thank you for answering. And to everyone out there, thank you for your excellent questions. Just remember that we have our next talk now. I forget. I think it was on the 16th of February. Just double check that. It's the third Wednesday. Yes, that's right. 16th February, we will be meeting again on Zoom for the York Civil War Roundtable. And thank you for attending tonight.